You can make money the hard way becoming a bullfighter, or save money the easy way with Xfinity Mobile. It sure beats making money as a human cannonball. Now through March 21st, learn how existing Xfinity customers can get a free line of unlimited intro for a year when they buy one unlimited line. That's hundreds of dollars in savings on your wireless bill. Visit XfinityMobile.com today. Restrictions apply. Xfinity Mobile requires Xfinity Internet. Reduced speeds after 20 gigabytes of usage per line. Data thresholds may vary.
Walmart Plus members save on meeting up with friends. Save on having them over for dinner with free delivery with no hidden fees or markups. That's groceries, plus napkins, plus that vegetable chopper to make things a bit easier. Plus, members save on gas to go meet them in their neck of the woods. Plus, when you're ready for the ultimate sign of friendship, start a show together with your included Paramount Plus subscription. Walmart Plus members save on this plus so much more. Start a 30-day free trial at walmartplus.com. Paramount Plus Essential Plan only. Separate registration required. See Walmart Plus terms and conditions.
For exclusive podcasts and more, sign up at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, a journalist flips the script by asking her subjects to shape their own stories. Does it create documentaries that are elevated or just something else? We'll talk about the podcast, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative from Radiotopia. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is private investigator, certified pet detective, resident cat lady, and author of the Piper Green series of cozy mysteries, Laura Bricker. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Rebecca. Also now the owner of some Cavassier, because I made a chicken with some Cavassier.
Wow. Well, you're fancy now.
You're the owner because you had leftover? You didn't use the entire bottle?
By the way, you're never going to use it. You're going to have that bottle forever.
No, I am. I'm going to make these recipes because I've been watching the reruns of the ladies' man from SNL who's like, I'm here with my Cavassier. So I'm like,
that was the inspiration.
The inspiration was a recipe I wanted to make, but now it's like my new lifestyle.
Yeah.
So did it taste good? Was it a good?
Yeah, it was delicious. It was like a roasted chicken with a cognac butter tarragon sauce.
Yeah.
And then at the end, you have to turn the oven off and then take it out. And then you baste a little more of the Cavassier or regular cognac, whatever you want to put on top, and then sit it in the oven for 10 minutes while it like takes it all in.
Ooh.
It's delicious.
You know you need next is a giant bottle of Galliano that you'll never use on your And finally,
it doesn't fit on any shelf. It's like way too high.
Exactly. And finally, our resident Doubting Thomas, author of the City Trilogy of novels, host of Strange Arrival, and our Patreon Deep Dive Book Club podcast host, Toby Ball. Hi, Toby.
Hey, Rebecca.
So, Laura, what's the countdown to LitFest looking like right now?
The countdown to LitFest is looking lit, Rebecca.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh, that was good, huh?
Yeah.
You are a marketing genius.
April 6th, Saturday is the main event in the town hall in Exeter. Saturday night, we're going to be doing a live taping of Crime Writers On at the Word Barn. And Friday night, I am hearing word because I'm helping organize it, that there's going to be a late night after hours speakeasy style party in Quaint AF Exeter.
Do we need to know the password to get in?
Yes, but I will tell all Crime Writers On listeners the password so they can go to the secret party.
Can I make an announcement about the live show?
Yes.
We will be discussing, and so you can do your homework, we will be discussing that night the Hulu series Death and Other Details.
Okay.
So watch up the series if you're coming so you'll know what we're talking about. I mean, you don't have to do that. A lot of people don't do that for a regular episode.
Do we have to watch it?
Yeah, almost all of us do.
Yeah, the four of us will do that. So.
We have to know what we're talking about. I know Mandy Patinkin's in it.
Yep.
Good old Mandy Patinkin. You know, he was in Evita.
Don't cry for me. No, he was the other part. He was like...
Along with Patti LuPone.
Wait, wasn't he like the dirty revolutionary?
Oh, maybe he was.
He wasn't, yeah.
He wasn't.
She was Evita Perón.
Dirty revolutionary. Jesus.
I don't know. I just know from the commercial. That's all.
Yeah, it's okay. Just to be clear, we watched, because Kevin got the same, even though he lived in Western Massachusetts and I lived on Long Island growing up, we had one television channel in common. It was Channel 11, WPIX, where I live. I don't know what channel number it
11
was.
Alive. Did anybody have the cable box that was the slider and you had to slide it up and down?
I didn't have that.
One of
We
those.
actually had over antenna.
Button, okay.
We had rabbit ears, and it was a rabbit ear channel for us. So because Kevin got this channel, he got a lot of tri-state area television commercials.
That's how I watched all my Abbott and Costello, all my Three Stooges.
And so he saw all the Carvel ads, even though you probably didn't have Carvel.
No, true.
And all of the Broadway show commercials were on WPIX, all of them. And those Broadway shows used to advertise the shit out of themselves, and there were Evita
Sunday,
commercials on all the time.
That's all I knew.
Do you remember how the Evita commercial started? Evita.
Yes, that's right.
Evita.
And who was playing? Was it Patti
LuPone?
Right, and she kind of spins.
Just spins around with her gorgeous muscular back.
Yes.
Don't cry for me, Argentina. It was a whole thing. Yeah, that commercial was on a million times.
Yeah,
It's
what else? And then it was
Cats.
A lot of stuff from Poconos along.
Anyway, so that's
the
how
Milford Plaza.
when Kevin and I first met, we realized we had this shared pop culture sensibility and we couldn't figure out why. Fucking WPIX.
Yeah, remember the Bugaloos?
Have we talked about the WPIX when they tried to do the video games on TV?
No.
They tried to do this. I was slightly older than you guys, so you guys may not have been watching the same stuff. But in the early days of like Atari, like Defender, do you remember that game?
Yeah.
So basically what they would do is they would have some guy in WPIX headquarters, and then they would show the game on the screen, and they'd get a kid on the phone, and he'd have to say picks. And whenever you'd say picks, the guy would push the shoot button.
Huh.
Like kids would go picks. But then like after about 3 of them, they just realized that they just went picks. Like the guy would just have to be like shooting it. So it'd be these kids just like without breathing saying picks as fast as they could for like a minute while some poor guy was like pounding on the shooting button on the thing. So anyway,
Incredible
I don't know why I'm telling you
television.
this.
It's not Romper Room.
It's better than Sigmund the Sea Monster, I'll tell you that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's
Deep cut.
Man of the
Well,
Lost.
you can tell that we are
Yeah.
very excited to talk about what we're talking about tonight. Hence our lengthy discussion of Evita ads and Andrew Lloyd Webber. Should we go ahead and get into what we're going to be talking about?
No, we haven't even mentioned what we're talking about on Monday.
Oh, what are we talking about on Monday's show, Kevin?
On Monday, we're going to be talking about the Netflix series, The Program, Cults, Cons, and Kidnapping.
I cannot wait to talk about that one. I
Right.
cannot wait. Okay, so now can we talk about what we're going to be talking about?
Absolutely.
Because I've been looking forward to this one. All right, let's do it. Let's go ahead and drop that first clip right now. Leading off.
I grew up with all of these ideas about storytelling as this noble art form. But approaching a decade of doing this work, I've got some questions about just what it is we think we're doing telling other people's stories.
Journalist Jess Shane had become disillusioned with the documentary industry and its effects on people profiled. She set off to create a new paradigm and craft stories with input from the people whose lives she's covering.
But I'm running these auditions to select the best stories to work with.
I want to tell my story because I feel it is important to really educate people.
Shane reveals her process of creating a new kind of storytelling featuring 4 people who'll receive compensation and editorial input. But after months of collaboration, the subjects are unable to offer meaningful contributions to Shane's presentation of their life stories. And the documentarian must confront what happens when subjects want more of the control she's offered.
I don't know, Jess. Right now, I don't know.
I'll remove all identifying details.
It's not enough. I want that aspect of my life deleted.
From PRX's Radiotopia Presents comes Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Shane lets listeners into her earnest project to create stories that do right by their subjects, only to learn what's lost by doing so. She also asks questions about the commoditization of nonfiction programs by the companies that supply them and the audiences that demand them. Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about plot points from Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. So if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down reviews. So Toby, at the beginning of this podcast, we hear Jess's mission, right? What she's aiming to do. And the podcast starts with a montage of her. She's obviously placed an ad and she's interviewing people who might be interested in participating in a documentary. And it very much surprised me after hearing her mission that she chose some very vulnerable people to feature in documentaries that she wants to be very ethical, right? Well, were you surprised, though, by her process itself and how she ended up choosing her subjects?
To me, and like, look, I do podcast documentaries, but very different kind of podcast documentaries. You know, I think the thing to do when you start one of these is to make sure you've got a good story on your hands before you start diving into sort of committing to making a documentary about it. And it seems like her process was essentially, I want to find people who have these sort of emotionally compelling life stories and then kind of do a bio of them in some way.
Or find an angle, right?
Right. And the way I'm going to do that is just by interviewing a whole bunch of people. And then the people who kind of strike me as fitting that profile, I'll take them and do it. That just doesn't seem like a great start, because what's going to seem very poignant to you is going to be people who have some trouble going on in their lives or have had trouble and are recovering from it, right? You're not going to pick somebody who's like, oh, I've got this, like, you know, I'm making a ton of money and I like got this great wife and all this stuff.
I'd like to hear that. That's actually, that's something I've heard before.
Yeah, well, that would be a nice break.
Yeah.
That would be it wouldn't be Crime Writers though. So when she's doing it, I'm like, I don't see this really ending up well. And for a minute, I was like, well, maybe she's doing 4 of them and she's going to pick one that actually sticks. Like maybe that is a way of doing it. Like you're kind of hedging your bets a little bit. But if you're going to do a podcast documentary on something, you need to do the legwork to know that your subject actually has what you want to do a podcast about, rather than picking somebody who seems kind of like they fall within this type and then hoping that they're have enough insight or their story's interesting enough or their voice is compelling enough or whatever that it's going to actually make a good podcast documentary. Because that didn't seem like that happened at all. It was just kind of like, oh, these 4 people seem better than the other people I interviewed, so I'll try them.
Should I be nervous? No. Okay.
I don't know. I don't think so. Okay. We're just going to have a chat.
Okay, cool.
But, you know, if you are nervous at any point and you're like, why are you asking this question? Like, you can ask me questions too.
Oh, trust me, I will. No.
Okay. One thing I was surprised by, Kevin, is that the premise of the podcast is documentaries are irresponsible or they are problematic in some way, right? That's sort of the setup. But then the only documentary we hear about is her own story about her experience with this gymnast who was unhappy with her documentary. That's the example she gives. I found myself thinking, have you been paying attention to anything else that's been made? Or do you only listen to your own work or the work that's in your own shell? Because there have been so many things that have been put out lately that are doing what it is that she says she's going to try to do. So many things where the right person is telling the story or the wall gets broken at some point during the storytelling and things change. But she really only starts here with this gymnast story. What did you think about that?
Well, first of all, I'll admire the concept of being iconoclastic. So, you know, why not challenge the rules of documentary making, especially in the light of fact, you know, people are making money on these enterprises. The creators are, not the subject. So I can kind of disagree with the idea of doing that while still admiring the effort to do something different and try this out as a proof of concept to either succeed or fail. Her motivation seems to be this earlier in her career story about the gymnast who was her neighbor or whatever. And, you know, she kind of learns later on that the subject was hurt by what the final product was. And
didn't like it. And so that kind of weighed on her. And so, right, this is the stepping off point. Can we make a documentary that doesn't hurt the feelings of the subject? Something that the subject feels like did right by them, okay? But one of the things is that, like, we never honestly heard whether or not the quality of that gymnast story was any good. Like, was it just that the gymnast disagreed with the direction that she took it? Maybe it was a super great documentary and now she feels differently about it because we heard that it got Jess a job.
Well, right.
But which a lot of this is about.
Is it today problematic to her because the subject was upset with it? Or is it because the subject happened to point out objective points, and objectively is not a way you can use here, but that the subject pulled out points and said, yeah, you're right. This wasn't as good as I thought it was. Because that's an issue too, that when you do nonfiction, you either betray your subject or you betray the audience.
I don't agree with, but...
Let me make my case here, because I have made it, and I think it's very important here, because I think that this proves the case in that in an explicit effort to not betray the subjects, to let them feel like they're involved and feel good about the whole thing and that their stories are completely told, we understand in the end that we, the audience, has been betrayed because Judy's story has been rewritten and altered to her benefit. And so what we heard wasn't the story that was supposed to be told. So rather than a feeling of like, aha, you've proven the point, I just end up feeling ripped off a bit. Like, man, I wish I could have heard what Judy's actual story was. The thing that you found, that you use your editorial judgment to find everybody else at Radiotopia who's been listening to all these tapes thought was the really good story, as opposed to now probably a sanitized one, or we'll just never know. We'll just never know what Judy's real story was, because the whole premise is to let Judy explain what she wants her story to be.
I could not disagree with you more.
All right, hit me.
Judy was betrayed so much more than I was in this podcast.
Okay.
Judy was a vulnerable person. Judy's entire character was drawn by, you are the same class as me.
I was always interested in the arts, and I majored in art and art history.
Me too. On some level, it comforted me that we had a shared class background.
I had the blessing of growing up with privilege.
And it seemed like the recognition was mutual.
We're going to get along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I know ticks the box of checking my privilege, yada, 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 but it was done in such a ham-fisted way to make Judy seem like an anomaly of an unhoused person when she is an extremely not anomalous unhoused person. The way that we hear Jess speak to Judy in this podcast is appalling, and not just when she's trying to get her to, change her story.
And I'm getting to the end of what I can do for Judy, too.
Seems like your priority is constantly more time, and my priority is like, what can we do right away?
I don't want to comment.
You can, and Laura, you might agree with this. There is a way, without giving up your journalistic integrity, to work with sources and stories. I mean, this is like a tenet of, what we do every day at my job.
Right.
Where there's an understanding of the process. You understand what journalism is, what we're doing here. You also understand that you're not going to have any control of the final product, but there's a sort of an agreement that you kind of get what you're getting into.
Right.
And you can be fair and representative without being a dick, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. But first, I'm going to say I totally agree with you about the way that Judy was talked to in this. Specifically, like there was this one part at the end that really stood out to me where Judy sounds very vulnerable to me because she's like talking about how like Jess is her friend. And then Jess doesn't like what Judy is giving her for feedback and says something to the effect of like, I'm the podcast producer and I know what I'm doing.
It's my art.
Yeah, my art, my story. And like, it felt to me condescending and it felt to me belittling.
This is a whole other path you're going down.
Yeah, I have gone down a whole other path because this is my artistic project. The thing is, Judy, I told you the last episode of the series is about correcting anything that was wrong in the first 3 episodes, and also the listening session that we did together, and also about this phone call, because this series is all about documentary and how people who sacrifice time and vulnerability kind of get left behind in that.
I want to talk to what you were talking about before, Rebecca, which is like when you work in journalism and the media. I've worked in this field now on and off for 25 years. And the thing is, you are always going to have somebody who doesn't like something that you have written, produced, or put out there. How I approach it and how you're saying you approach it is like, I'm always very open with people about this is what I'm hearing you say. Like, I really make sure that I'm hearing what people are saying and that I'm trying to really understand where they're coming from so that I'm fair. In the end, yes, I'm the one that is telling the story, but that comes after, I think, having the type of open dialogue with somebody that you're interviewing where you're asking them the same question in multiple different ways sometimes to make sure you really understand how they feel about something, where they're coming from something. And you're not doing it in a way where you're changing the story because of something they're asking you to do. You're really clarifying what their story is, what their position is, what the facts are, And I was very open with people, like, this is going to be in the story. And I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to try to treat your story with dignity, and I'm going to try to be fair to you, and I'm going to try to do this story justice. But at the same time, it is my job to tell the story.
Yeah. I have a question, Toby, that I was very curious about, because Jess is extremely disappointed by not getting great editorial feedback from her subjects, right? What do you think Jess thought that these three vulnerable people, again, that she's covering in these stories, were going to say to her in this editing session? Were they going to give comments about story structure? I mean, she was so upset that she wasn't getting the kind of feedback she needed from the process. Like, what were you thinking that she thought was going to happen there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess my assumption was that she was hoping maybe they would pick up on like nuances about themselves that she didn't quite get. And they could be like, well, when you say this, I wasn't quite meaning that. I was meaning this, or this thing that I said, if it could be contextualized in this way or something, but just give her some guidance in like, okay, you've basically got this stuff and like, this is how you mold it to more accurately reflect me. I mean, that's a lot to ask of people, I think. I read, a friend of mine wrote an autobiography and asked if I would read it, and I did, and very smart guy and stuff, but it was just like thing after thing after thing. And when I read it, I was like, it seems like there are these two like major things that happen, and if you kind of built it all around those two things, like these seems like turning points in your life, and that friend was just didn't see it, And I think it's hard, especially if it's something in audio that's much shorter or whatever, and you're listening to it and it's like coming back to you in a way that's edited, and to be able to immediately give back some kind of quality, nuanced, insightful feedback that's going to help a journalist like more accurately present you. It seems unrealistic. I mean, I think maybe if you're doing it about a bunch of other podcast producers and you follow them around, like they might be able to think about it.
Or some lower stakes stories, maybe.
Yeah, she keeps talking about her podcast skills and her production skills or whatever. And I think part of it, like that kind of storytelling is stuff that you kind of learn, and asking somebody to talk about their trauma in a way that's podcast ready, like giving notes on your trauma to somebody who's done a podcast. It just doesn't feel realistic to me.
Yeah, the lack of quality input from Ernesto and Michael doesn't mean that they necessarily blessed what they heard. I think they acknowledge that too. That in the moment you might feel sheepish and, basically asking for some kind of confrontation. But the lack of input is its own kind of input. And I'm wondering if they knew that Judy sort of had these last minute demands or concerns and wanted these certain changes, whether they may have felt empowered to ask for the changes that they wanted. And can I talk about, you guys brought up the Judy call. Can I get in on that?
Heck yes.
Because I feel like that was the moment where I'm like, Dr. Frankenstein, meet your monster. Because you could see that coming from a mile away, which is that this is the moment where we feel the destruction of her story and the whole premise falling apart. And basically, in this case, disproving that you can do this thing that you want to do. Because when you're talking about this being your art, I mean, that's what you're saying the whole problem is to begin with, that someone needs to have editorial control. And if you're giving that away, at what part do you want to give that away? Certainly when you're like talking up against a deadline, you're like, what the actual fuck? But the whole idea that this isn't the kind of pushback I wanted, this isn't the kind of, like, I have a really great story here.
I was going to win an award.
Yeah, everybody's, and we keep hearing the feedback from the editors at Radiotopia that, like, they're like, I don't know why you have Ernesto, but this Judy story is fantastic. And you find out later that the Judy story we heard, like, holy shit, that wasn't the good story.
Yeah.
There's a much better story someplace, and this is where it died, was right here. I mean, like, if you want to get, like, really great stories, join us on Patreon.
Oh.
Because we've got all sorts of stories there.
What a good transition to the business section, Kevin.
We have, I just counted this past month, we had 18 exclusive and early drops on our Patreon.
Wow.
What a fantastic deal that is. Go to patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia. You get the Crime Writers on After Show. You get our Married with Podcast advice show. We also get Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast. Toby's next guests are Alex Segura, Chris Joyner, and Deb Schutica. And what is the book that you're going to be talking about, Toby?
We're going to be talking about the assassination of Fred Hampton, how the FBI and the Chicago police murdered a Black Panther by Jeffrey Haas.
And have you finished reading the book?
I just finished reading the title of the book, Kevin, and that's about as far as I've gotten so far.
I'm glad it's your audience. I understand that. You betrayed yourself, but not your audience.
Exactly.
I appreciate your candor there. Also, Laura Bricker has her Leave It to Bricker podcast. And speaking of book clubs, Laura, you bring us inside your own crazy real life Shouldn't It Be book club?
The No Rules Book Club, where last month a bottle of champagne the top was cut off with a knife, and this month
I don't know what to do with books, but all right.
Is bringing a saber. So like a sword is coming to our book club. It's very exciting. We don't all have to read the same book. Some people read books and tell us what they recommend. Some of us talk about books we might want to read. And it's the No Rules Book, Gun, Smut, and Saber Club. So you'll hear all about that. So maybe you can franchise this and move it around the country.
We also have an Amazon storefront where you can see some of our favorite things. Rebecca Lavoie, what are this week's Amazon recommendations?
My favorite is the Max Studio short tiered summer dress. I have it in many colors.
And Toby Ball, what are your listener-inspired Toby Ball's deep cut recommendations?
Well, first off, I've got the Up Home Bathroom Rug 20 by 31 inch black boho bath mat non-slip geometric Moroccan farmhouse bath rug, soft velvet machine washable bathroom mats for tub.
Good cut, yeah.
Next up, I've got the glass cuticle pusher by Gladzy. Manicure stick, genuine check quality, professional precision filing cuticle remover, abrasive surface, never wears ooh.
What is that last part? Never wears ooh.
It's just OU.
Never wears out.
It may have been out, but I didn't want to. Again, don't want to betray the reader by.
Yes.
No, you got it. Yeah, that's good.
I picked that one particularly because I hadn't known that people from the Czech Republic were so anal about their cuticles that when you're rating cuticle pushers, they say it's Czech quality. So if anybody's got any info on that, send that my way.
Who knew? All right, you can shop us first at amazon.com/shop/CrimeWritersOn. We earn commissions on qualified purchases.
All right, Kevin, before we end the business section, I have to ask, do we have any Patreon patron saints of the week this week?
Our Patreon patron saints are Lindsay Masters and Samantha Marquez. Bless you.
Bless you, Lindsay. Bless you, Samantha. Thank you so much for supporting us on Patreon. Thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon and to everyone who's considering doing it. I really recommend it. Everybody who joins pretty much says they love it back there. Head on over now to patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. Kevin, does thus end the business section?
Thus ends the business section.
I'm going to go ahead and fade that music out right now.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. With the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers. In fact, Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcast free. All lowercase, shopify.com/podcast free, shopify.com/podcast free.
So I just want to throw something out there. I think one really great way to form relationships with and do documentaries responsibly, which we've heard lots of times, where we hear people really being represented in a way that I think really shows who they are. I mean, I really do think, and I'm just going to be as kind as I can here, because I know a lot of this podcast, the people who worked on it are nice and earnest people, right?
Sure.
I like a lot of the things that we critique. There's an earnest, good-hearted intent here. That being said, I really feel like it was created in some sort of silo where other media does not exist, because there are so many great pieces of media being made where people are being represented fairly while good journalism is still happening. You know, while things change maybe during the story making process. Like I think of Bone Valley or something as a great example of that, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
We have a great journalist there who started in going to tell the story extremely objectively. And then at one point during the story, the wall kind of breaks and he really becomes invested in Leo's actual innocence and decides, fuck it. Like I am now like half journalist, half advocate. And he's still doing the real journalism, still doing all the steps of journalism, but also in some ways collaborating with the cause, right? We have that. We have, we're going to be talking about The Program, where I think is another wonderful example of a storyteller doing something first person, very much about her, but also bringing in other people affected, letting them represent themselves and telling their own stories, unedited, you know, sort of very raw, ugly at sometimes in the thing. Like there is stuff happening in the world that is accomplishing like this wonderful, beautiful change in journalism. It does exist, and it is not a question of letting go of all of the things that make stories interesting. It's just not. Like there was a moment in this podcast where they talked about 20 drafts of an episode, and I was flabbergasted by that. Absolutely flabbergasted. I'm like, this is why narrative podcasting is not going well. Like I know a lot of very high quality shops, and if I told them that they had to make 20 drafts of an episode, they'd be like, yeah, no.
That makes me wonder, like, were the first 19 bad, or are they just tweaking to make it precious?
I mean, if you have to go back and forth with legal, I know, by the way, I've heard the Serial team sometimes does like 100, and I'm like, it sounds like it because that shit is so overworked. But like, this is not a high stakes enterprise. This is a story about Jess. Jess admits this is a story about Jess. Why are we going through 20 drafts of a story about Jess? Like, why couldn't it be looser? Why couldn't it be freer? Why couldn't it not exist in a silo? Like, that's something about this that really struck me.
Well, I mean, for all of her saying that this is her story, she's the storyteller here, the reality is we hear that there are multiple storytellers, editors, other people that put their finger on this and say you need to do it this way or you can't do it this way, because that's the nature of commercial.
That's just production.
Yeah. I mean, kudos for putting the executive producer at Radiotopia in the tape so that you hear those discussions. We also realize, you know, at the end, she tells Jess in no uncertain terms,
this is a business.
We got to put something on the fucking air.
Right.
You know,
I actually
so
like
you got to wrap it up.
Yeah.
You know, we care about Judy. We want her to come out well in the end. And I'm just worried it's going to feel, I don't know, like too watered down or not authentic or just not as interesting.
You can draw your own conclusion about what that means to the actual podcast, because there's the podcast that we're hearing and there's this experiment. And how does that reality affect both of those things?
Right.
Well, I mean, the issue that comes up is that the boundaries are so blurred here that in one of the scenes that really stuck with me was Michael, who, you know, starts to send her pictures of his life, of himself every day, and like wants to go roller skating. In the beginning, the way that she's analyzing it, it felt very naive because it felt very clear to me that this guy was thinking that they were going to be more than friends. And when you listen to the tape, you can see that. So I think that's the challenge in something like this, is that when you go in and you're collaborating, your interview subjects sometimes can get confused about the nature of the relationship. And I think that was a really clear-cut example of that there. And the same thing with Judy. It's okay to be empathetic. It's okay to see where people are coming from. But when you're getting that involved, I think it's hard to remain objective.
I think it is and I don't know what Michael was thinking, but I do know that Michael is a formerly incarcerated man in an extremely vulnerable position. And I think that for Jess to have to listen back to her own tape to understand that this is a complicated situation for him betrays that she is picking the wrong people to experiment with.
Yes.
That's what made me so angry about this. I'm like, you're performing an experiment with people who are in extremely vulnerable positions. And I hear her saying things like, I'm going to use this to get a job. I could win an award from this. I statement. I'm like, Michael is deluded. He believes that his self-published book is going to be a bestseller. He believes he's going to be a successful public speaker. These are things that you hear formerly incarcerated people say all the time because they went through a program in incarceration, which, it's like an incarceration program designed to give you confidence outside, but like, this is a vulnerable person, and using them for your experiment is not okay, in my opinion. And then sort of not acknowledging that it's going that way, but making it again about he thinks he's going to date me, another I statement. It really struck me as just very, if I were the editor, that's where I'd have the conversation. Toby, there was an editorial process thing here, Toby, and I actually liked that they included Audrey's tape about this being a business. Like, yeah, we're a nonprofit, but we're a business. Like that to me is like, that was the only point of the podcast where I was like, oh, more of that. Like, I'd love more of that. That was reminding me of a podcast just transparent about podcast making. But what did you think about what we heard about the editorial process? Like, were you confused at all about that?
It's not the process I've experienced, but I think I just kind of found Jess to be so sort of idealistic, but without sort of taking into account like what's actually necessary in order to put out a podcast that's going to be any good. I mean, I could see where the producers would struggle with it, right? Because the reason why they're working with her is because they believe in what she's doing and stuff. But the fact that it's taking so long and she's trying to undermine herself by living up to these preconceived values or problems that she thinks she finds in the podcast documentary realm, that, she's really sort of self-sabotaging in some ways. I didn't focus a whole lot on that stuff other than it's not an unpleasant working relationship. I mean, it seemed as though they all kind of got along and stuff, but it didn't seem like they were all kind of moving in the same direction. I mean, it did seem like Jess was a whole bunch of cats that were having to be herded towards actually producing something.
Do you feel like this podcast was ready for air? I guess is the question I have for you.
It's not. I mean, I listened to it. I'm like, will this ever be ready to air in some ways? Because I think in the end, it's not satisfying, because I think the conclusion, and Kevin touched on this before, like the conclusion of her experiment is, I'm willing to sabotage this podcast because one of my subjects doesn't want this part of her story told, even though she told it to me, understanding that it was being on tape. And so I'm just not going to run it. And so the best part of everything that I did is going to remain hidden. What would have been interesting to me to hear would have been for her to play, okay, this is the story that Judy wanted to tell. Okay. And it goes up to here, because she says it's basically like the first half of what she'd produced. So like, what do you think now? Like, what's the story now? Blah, blah, blah. All right, here's the rest of it. Now think about the whole thing as a whole. And think about, why would Judy not want this part told? Why is this the part that's compelling? Like, what kind of conclusions can we draw from that? Like, that to me seems like that should have been the final product. And I get that that kind of goes against her instincts and what her project was going to be. But that's where you see the difference, right? That's where you see the difference between, oh, I'm going to let them tell me what to do, and I've got all this stuff. I'm going to make the best possible thing I can. And then allow people to kind of wrestle with that. But again, I mean, that doesn't seem to be where she's personally coming from, and that she's more concerned about her relationship with Judy than she is about the final product of this podcast.
They told me, they say writers are supposed to be ready to kill their darlings. Yes. They're just not supposed to let someone else murder them.
Yeah.
Right? You're handing someone else the dagger. You're like, why are my darlings bleeding on the floor? Because that's what you set up. That was what you wanted to do.
Why are we supposed to assume it was really a darling, though? Everything else we heard wasn't.
Well, it certainly was built up like it was.
Right.
Like everyone says they wanted, the editors, even Jess was like, this was a great story.
I was going to win an award. No, I'm not assuming it was the darling. I'm not.
You got to assume it was better than what you got.
What, the Michael story, which was horrible?
Everybody who's heard it stipulates it was better than that.
I mean, I think one thing is I found that this was actually her MFA project. I feel like that academic examination of the ethics around documentary making that seems like an appropriate venue for that to me, more so than the product that we got, if that makes sense.
Well, this is what, I mean, I'm not comparing this to like the work that happens at my day job. And I also did not work on this really at all. But this is what Bear Brook season 2 is about. It's about who gets to tell the story and like what happens when, you know, it gets told through different lenses, right? So this is a question that I wrestle with all the time at work, and we wrestle with it all the time on Outside In, actually, because there's this sort of, that team has sort of this like, that same philosophy they have at national parks, like leave nothing behind, like leave things as good as they were when you went in to do your work. And this conversation happens constantly because we do a lot of reporting around Indigenous communities. We do a lot of reporting around, you know, communities that were harmed by environmental events. And it is incredibly important to, without saying, let's let you listen to it before we publish it, because that's a no, by saying like, am I getting this right? So like repeating it back to them and saying like, is that right? Am I getting this right? Like you ask questions like that. That is the kind of collaboration that works, like letting people participate in such a way that they feel heard. And the way that you know that works is that you send them the story after, you maintain the relationships after, and you ask for feedback after it's published. And then you have a conversation after it's published that continues, right? Like that is how you learn how to do stuff like this. And you learn as a journalist to do that job kind of better. It's just interesting to me because it's like diving into this, just making all these assumptions about what's right, what's wrong, telling us it's just very, very simple. And I think there were ways to work with Judy that weren't just saying like, it has to be this or this. It has to be my way or your way, my way or your way. Like, and also the Michael thing, we hear this very quick excerpt from the phone call of, oh, I called him and he said it was fine. I don't know. It's just that there's a lot about that. It just made me, and I agree with you. I don't think Ernesto was happy with his edit.
And he had a hard time articulating what or why. Do we even know if Judy liked how the final product was? Did she even go back to her again and say, okay, I did all this for you?
Judy was lovely. Judy was such a lovely, kind person who is just so generous with her time and with her thoughts. And the idea that like she'd be able to operate on an editorial schedule at all with what's going on in her life is like wild to me. Like this is why she shouldn't have been part of the experiment, really, because again, she's a vulnerable person. I don't know. It's interesting. But yeah, that's an interesting question. And that is part of the responsibility, I think, when you're working with vulnerable people is to follow up.
One last thing I'm thinking of is remember that we're talking about people that were self-selected and were paid for their stories, because this is what we're saying. This is what the experiment is. It's part experiment. It's part art piece. And we have to wonder, because of the challenge, could this have been pulled off by a different content creator? Which is not a put down of Jess, but I'm just saying everybody has a different way of doing this. And some people might rise to the challenge in a different way. And I think Toby mentioned it, like, what are the 50 people that you interviewed? What if you selected other people? Could you prove the thesis statement, which is that it is possible to put together an entertaining, ethically produced documentary with the explicit input of the subjects? Could that be done? I still doubt it, but I don't think that it isn't worth trying or at least looking at. But in the end, I don't know if you guys feel it. It's like the experiment failed and you made the experiment. It's fine, experiment, but I think you just show that, you can't do that. It's one or the other. Anyone agree, disagree?
I think the power imbalance in those relationships, regardless of how much she's trying to bring them into the process, is too much to overcome for this experiment. I think if she wants to do it, if she finds somebody who's interesting, has a compelling story, but also like that $20 is not like screaming their name, or they don't have all these other sort of things going on with their lives or in their past that make them vulnerable. That's just a different situation. Somebody who doesn't have quite as much at stake. I mean, even like Judy.
Find another gymnast,
yeah,
right?
I mean, Judy's like, I'm hoping this thing is going to, like, somebody's going to hear my story and it's going to help me out. It's like, fuck, that's nuts. Not that she's nuts for thinking about that, but that if I was a podcaster doing this podcast and somebody said that to me, I'd be like, man, like this is not going to happen. And she helped her out to try and find housing. But that was a whole nother thing. It's like, that just seemed like another complication that was going to kind of get in the way of this experiment. I don't know. It just seemed kind of hopeless.
Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. With the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers. In fact, Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcast free. All lowercase, shopify.com/podcast free, shopify.com/podcast free.
Okay, let's do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out Radiotopia Presents Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative? Laura Bricker, what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down for this podcast?
I'm going thumbs down on this. And I feel badly going thumbs down on this because I think that this was undertaken by Jess in a very earnest way in which she wanted to do something that was going to be meaningful, that was going to examine the ethics around making documentaries, how subjects are portrayed, how they're treated, how they work together with the people that are making the documentaries. And I think that's an interesting premise. And I think the idea of examining ourselves as an industry and examining the ethics of our industry and how we do our business, I mean, I think that's a noble goal. For me, though, it really fell flat in that area. I felt very badly for Judy and Judy's treatment in this podcast. She was really being talked down to. And I felt like that was not the intention of this project. That was not the intention of how this was going to be undertaken. But it really didn't sit well with me. And it didn't sit well with me that we had people from pretty vulnerable populations being used as sort of an experiment here. So I think that the idea of examining ethics is great. I think these were not the subjects to do it with, and that's why I'm going thumbs down.
Toby Ball.
Yeah, I'm a thumbs down too. I just feel like the initial premise is a little bit of a straw man. I mean, are there unethical documentaries? Sure. Do the sort of the rules that you're supposed to follow in making documentaries inevitably lead to ones that are unethical? I don't agree with that at all. I mean, I think you can try and do documentaries in a different way without it just being like this sort of big critique of how people make documentaries in general. And I like it when people try new things. I mean, I think I've been pretty consistent about that, even when I don't always like the end product, is that like, I'm glad that somebody tried something different. In this case, I just kind of feel like what she's critiquing, like, doesn't quite ring true. And then there's a part of it of making documentaries, which is the stuff that you do before you even select a subject. Like, you have to do the legwork to find the right subject to do. And there's a bunch of different things that go into it. And it's like, what are you trying to get across? What subject or who are you going to look at or whatever to get that thing across? And it's hard to, if you don't know if something's going to be interesting and you find out that it's not, then keep going through with it. That was a part that was missing. I think she had the stuff here to make a more nuanced and interesting argument, but it's a difficult subject. And I think some of the things that she was going to have to do to make a more powerful critique of this was going to end up betraying sort of the principles that started this whole thing off that she thought. And I think sort of ironically, those principles, which she thought she could make an ethical podcast with, kind of kept her from making a podcast that was in the end sort of successful and interesting. So it's a thumbs down. And I, again, sort of appreciate the effort and the idea, but the execution, it just feels like it's just not there or not even really close.
Kevin Flynn.
I'm going to go thumb sideways, and let me explain why. I mean, I think this is a podcast whose reach exceeded its grasp. It had a very provocative, ambitious thesis, create a great podcast story that will satisfy the subjects, or at least treat them in an ethical way that they would not otherwise be treated by whatever measure that is. And by its scientific method approach, proved its own failure, because when you do this, you either betray the subject by giving an unvarnished look at their story, telling things that maybe they don't see or maybe they wouldn't like, or you betray the audience by holding back those things and not letting us get a good view of this person and giving us an artificial view of who they actually are. And in this case, in the end, it felt like you betrayed both. It's like trying to prove something is poisonous by dying. This is what happens when you give veto power of the story over to the subject of the story. It ends up creating some weak tea. I'm still thumbs sideways because it brings up a lot of thoughtful situation so that you could go through it, and they don't go deep into all of them, but the idea about, okay, this is commoditization, that people are making money off of other people's stories and they may not like what the end product is, and how are we using it, and kind of at the answer of the last thing is a wink at us, like saying like, well, how, you're the ones that are listening to this, what do you think about all this? But the idea that one could create a good story doing it this way is proven wrong. And what that leaves us with is a bad podcast story. We realize later, especially after we hear some clips of like what the original unedited ideas were, that this ended up being a changed podcast, and a podcast that wasn't changed for the better. So in any event, I can't say that this was good, but I think some people might want to listen to it so that they can contemplate what is happening here and to see for themselves, could this have been done in a different way that would have satisfied the scientific or artistic or academic thesis of this? I don't know, but that's where I am.
Okay, so can I just do a quick disclaimer before I give my review?
Sure.
I have some professional overlap with the network that's distributing this podcast. I don't work with Radiotopia or PRX, but they are in the public radio sphere, right? And I work in public radio. So, it's not infrequent that we review things where I know some of the people involved in it. It happens all the time. In the commercial space, when we give feedback and harsh feedback on things, it feels very different to me than in the public radio space, because commercial people seem to be able to absorb critical feedback in a different way. Like we'll say something awful about a podcast in Campside, and we'll hear from someone on Campside who's like, yeah, I didn't really love it either. Thanks for featuring it. You know what I mean? It just feels different because there's but that is part of the problem. And that's actually like one of the things that I want to talk about, because I haven't disliked a podcast as much as I disliked this one in a really long time. Just because a podcast is coming out from a network that you typically like, and just because a podcast sounds good, and just because a podcast is made with earnest and good intentions and is sound designed well and mixed well, and doesn't mean it can't be truly terrible and on like several levels. And I really, really disliked this podcast. It made me so angry at some points, and I actually found myself dreading listening to the next episode at points. I was like, dear Lord, do I have to? I found it to be completely smug. I found it to be full of I statements to a point where it's like if you made a drinking game counting the I statements, you'd be dead. It sort of suffers from the public radio disease, as I've come to think of it, of storytelling, where they depend on things like the storytelling structure, which he talks about. They depend on things like over-editing to the point of overworking. And they say things like, this story about your life is my art. Like there is an art of storytelling, but somebody else's story is not art. It is somebody else's story, right? And that is really troublesome to me in many, many ways. And I feel like people are going to walk away from this thinking they're going to be learning something about ethics, and they're going to be learning the wrong things about ethics, in my opinion. The use of very vulnerable people in an experiment is troubling, especially when the experiment starts to fall apart and that becomes incredibly visible. I think this thing should have been spiked at that point. That is my opinion as an editor. There are really big red flags for me. And I just think that either it should have been spiked or it should have had more time, or the stories being told about these people should not have been about their vulnerabilities. I guarantee each of these subjects had a very interesting aspect of their life that was not about the most vulnerable part of their life. I guarantee it, because everybody has a really fascinating component of their life. So yeah, I don't like this show. So I'm going to give it a thumbs down, and I really wanted to explain why thoroughly and completely. I hope that comes across. So thumbs down for me for this. And if you want to hear more about what it's like to criticize people who made something that you kind of know, listen to this week's after show, because we talk about that a little bit more in our Patreon. Okay, that's going to do it for us. But before we go, Laura Bricker, big switch of topic. Do we have a cat of the week this week?
We have a cat of the week, and this is like my most favorite story that I have seen about cats in a long time.
Did you give the cat any input on this, or are you just going to tell it yourself?
I am just telling this story. A Massachusetts library system will let you pay fines with cat pictures.
You're 1,000% sure that's what they meant by cat pictures.
It is not often, this is the article that says, it is not often that cat photos are accepted as currency. But for the month of March, public libraries in Worcester, Massachusetts will wipe certain fines from your account if you submit any picture of a cat. Branches of the Worcester Public Library system don't charge fees for overdue books, but they do charge for lost or damaged ones. The call for cat pictures is a way to keep those bills from preventing people from using the library.
What if you don't have a cat? You can just bring a picture of anybody's cat.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
If only there were a place to find photos of cats.
It is part of March Meowness, a month of cat-centric programming that includes a screening of the 2019 movie Cats, a cat eye makeup tutorial, a de-stressing hour of playing with shelter cats, cat crafts, and more events. There's a nice picture of a cat on library books, peeking out. Any picture of cats will do. They don't have to be on library books.
I think the whole point here, Laura, is that libraries shouldn't have fees, and that's kind of a movement that's taking over a little bit, because fees at libraries discourage people from using libraries and returning to libraries, and that's a big movement now, and this is actually a really fun way of doing no fees.
You either betray the readers or you betray the books.
They are
We
really...
could do an experiment about this.
Is this good? Is this a good way of not publicizing your new no fee system? I think it is.
Yeah.
All right, Laura Bricker, if you want people to follow you online so they can see pictures of your cats, how can they find you there?
You can find me at Laura Bricker on Twitter and Instagram.
What about you, Toby Ball? People want to see how surprisingly nimble you are. How can they find you online?
At Toby Ball and H.
What about you, Kevin Flynn? How can you be found?
I'm at Kevin P. Flynn.
If you want to follow me everywhere, maybe argue with me a little bit about my opinions about podcasts, trust me, it happens all the time. You can find me at Reb Lavoie. You can also follow the show everywhere at Crime Writers On. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook, on YouTube. But really, what you should do is join our incredible, warm, supportive, lovely, totally non-toxic Facebook group. Just go to Facebook, find us there. We have a pinned post where you can join the group. Get episodes early and ad-free at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. You'll get all the other shows we make back there. There are hundreds of them. Our theme song was composed and performed by Ty Gibbons. Our line editor is the very wonderful Livy Burdett. The executive producer of this program is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in the Treehouse Yoga Studio above the Mockingbird Cafe in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where we also eat pizza and give tepid feedback about our work. Kevin, really good diction you got there. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening.
I don't know if I like the way I sound.
Thanks for listening. We will catch you later.
Our spoiler-free reviews begin in the last 18 minutes of that episode.
I don't get... Each of you was very long.
Yeah, we were long.
That's
I'm
fine.
just pointing it out.
Is that a Bigfoot mug, Rebecca?
It is. A listener made it.
And here is my Kevin Yeti.
Oh, yeah, look at that. With bigger font.
With executive producer.
Which, by the way, if I had just hit return in between the two words, apparently it wouldn't have been so tiny. I only believe in vessels that make my head look really small.
There you go.
They make me feel petite.
in crime media.
Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. With the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers. In fact, Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/podcastfree. All lowercase, shopify.com/podcastfree, shopify.com/podcastfree.